A black woman stands in court, desperately pleading her case. Suddenly, with one powerful gesture, she brings the entire room to stunned silence. No one saw this coming. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video and comment on where you're watching from. Let's get started. Maya Johnson's hands trembled as she clutched the worn manila folder to her chest. The courthouse hallway stretched before her like a tunnel, the heavy oak doors at the end both a destination and a barrier. She had prepared for this moment for 3 years, but now that it had arrived, she felt her carefully constructed confidence crumbling. "Remember, stay calm," her attorney, Sandra Wilson, whispered beside her. "Judge Harrison has a reputation for being impatient with emotional displays." Maya nodded, though her throat had gone dry. The folder contained everything: the evidence, the testimonies, the records she'd fought so hard to obtain, records that powerful people had tried to bury, records that could change everything. "The court calls case number 47291, Johnson versus Westfield Medical Center," the bailiff announced as they entered the courtroom. Maya felt the weight of dozens of eyes as she walked down the center aisle. On the left side sat the hospital's legal team, 4 white men in expensive suits, their leather briefcases gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Their lead counsel, Richard Grayson, didn't even glance in her direction. He was busy reviewing documents, his silver hair catching the light, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The confidence of a man who had never lost. The right side of the courtroom was nearly empty, just 2 of Maya's former co-workers who had risked their jobs to support her claim. They offered encouraging smiles as she passed. Judge Harrison peered over his reading glasses as Maya took her seat. His expression gave nothing away, but Maya had researched him extensively. 67 years old, appointed during a conservative administration, with a history of ruling in favor of corporations. The odds were stacked against her, but that was nothing new. "Ms. Wilson, you may present your opening statement," Judge Harrison said, his voice as dry as parchment. Sandra rose, straightening her blazer. "Your Honor, this case is about justice delayed but not denied. For 15 years, my client, Maya Johnson, served as a nurse at Westfield Medical Center, maintaining an exemplary record. She was dedicated, competent, and trusted by both patients and colleagues. Yet 3 years ago, she was abruptly terminated after reporting serious patient safety violations in the hospital's new emergency care protocol." Maya watched the judge's face, searching for any reaction. Harrison's expression remained impassive as Sandra continued. "The evidence will show that Westfield Medical Center not only wrongfully terminated Ms. Johnson, but engaged in a systematic effort to silence her through intimidation, defamation, and manipulation of medical records. We will demonstrate that the hospital violated whistleblower protection laws, engaged in racial discrimination, and most seriously, altered patient records to conceal negligence that resulted in preventable deaths." At this, Richard Grayson finally looked up, his expression one of practiced indignation. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making inflammatory accusations without foundation." "I'm simply outlining what the evidence will show," Sandra replied evenly. "Save the dramatics for your closing, Ms. Wilson," Judge Harrison said. "Continue, but stick to the facts." Maya felt a familiar weight settling in her chest. The same weight she'd carried since that April morning 3 years ago when she'd first noticed the discrepancies in the medication protocols. As a senior emergency department nurse, she had immediately recognized the danger. The new digital system was miscalculating dosages for certain medications, particularly for patients with kidney impairment. She had followed protocol, reporting it to her supervisor, then to the medical director, and finally to the hospital administration. For weeks, nothing happened. Then patients began dying, patients who should have recovered. When Maya documented the correlation between the deaths and the medication errors, she was called into a meeting with the hospital's legal team. They explained there must be some misunderstanding. The system had been thoroughly tested. Perhaps she had made errors in her assessment, but Maya knew what she had seen. She had kept her own records, documented every case. When she refused to back down, the retaliation began. First, her shifts were changed. Then came the write-ups for minor infractions that had never been issues before. Finally, she was accused of medication errors herself, errors she knew she hadn't made. Sandra's voice pulled Maya back to the present. We will show that after my client reported these issues, Westfield Medical Center engaged in a coordinated campaign to discredit her, ultimately falsifying records to suggest that Ms. Johnson herself was responsible for medication errors that resulted in patient harm. Grayson stood again. Your Honor, these are serious accusations against a respected institution. Ms. Wilson is suggesting a conspiracy with no evidence beyond her client's disgruntled claims. We have the evidence, Your Honor, Sandra responded, including testimony from other staff members who witnessed the alteration of records. Judge Harrison waved his hand dismissively. I'll hear the evidence before making any determinations. Mr. Grayson, your opening statement. Richard Grayson approached the bench with the smooth confidence of a man who had spent decades in courtrooms just like this one. Your Honor, Westfield Medical Center has served this community for over 70 years with distinction and integrity. These allegations are not only false, but represent a disturbing attempt by a former employee to extract money from a vital public institution. Maya felt her jaw tighten as Grayson continued. The facts are simple. Ms. Johnson was terminated for cause after multiple documented instances of failure to follow hospital protocols. Her performance had been declining for months before her termination. When faced with these documented deficiencies, rather than accepting responsibility, Ms. Johnson fabricated these outlandish claims of conspiracy and discrimination. Maya glanced at the jury. 8 women, 4 men. Most avoided her eyes, already swayed by Grayson's authoritative presence. She had seen this before, how easily people deferred to authority, especially when that authority wore the mantle of medical expertise. The hospital's digital record system was designed by industry leaders and implemented at medical centers nationwide without incident. It includes multiple safeguards against the very errors Ms. Johnson claims to have identified. We will demonstrate that Ms. Johnson's allegations are not only false but technically impossible. Grayson returned to his seat, exchanging satisfied nods with his colleagues. Maya felt a flutter of panic. She leaned toward Sandra. They're going to claim the records can't be altered. Sandra squeezed her hand reassuringly. We expected that, trust me. The judge called the first witness, and the hospital's strategy quickly became clear. A parade of administrators and doctors testified to the system's reliability, the hospital's commitment to safety, and Maya's alleged history of performance issues that had mysteriously begun after 15 years of exemplary service. By the afternoon break, Maya felt drained. In the hallway, Sandra pulled her aside. They're following the playbook we anticipated. Tomorrow we present our case. They're going to say I'm lying, Maya said quietly. That I made it all up because I was bitter about being disciplined. Let them, Sandra replied. We have something they don't expect. Back in the courtroom, the hospital's final witness of the day was Dr. Lawrence Phillips, the medical director who had initially dismissed Maya's concerns. As he described Maya as combative and resistant to change, she felt a surge of anger that threatened to overwhelm her practiced composure. Ms. Johnson seemed to have difficulty adapting to our new digital systems, Dr. Phillips testified smoothly. When her performance issues were addressed, she became defensive and began making unfounded accusations. Maya watched the jury, noticing how they nodded along with his testimony. She saw what they saw, a distinguished physician with decades of experience versus a nurse who appeared increasingly agitated as she listened. When court adjourned for the day, Maya felt defeated. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered, alerted to the David versus Goliath nature of the case. "Ms. Johnson, do you really believe the hospital conspired against you?" one called out. "Do you have any actual evidence of record tampering?" asked another. Maya kept her head down, following Sandra to the parking lot. "I can't do this," she whispered. "Yes, you can," Sandra insisted. "Tomorrow is our day. Remember what we found." Maya clutched her folder tighter. Inside was the key, the evidence that had taken her 3 years to compile, the proof that would either save her or destroy her completely. As she drove home to her small apartment, past the hospital where she had once proudly worn her uniform, Maya rehearsed what would happen tomorrow. She would take the stand. She would tell her truth. And then, when the moment was right, she would make the move that would change everything. She just had to find the courage to follow through. Maya barely slept that night. She tossed and turned, her mind replaying the day's testimony, imagining tomorrow's cross-examinations. By dawn, she sat at her kitchen table, reviewing her notes one final time, her coffee growing cold beside her. The evidence she had gathered wasn't just about her wrongful termination. It was about the 7 patients who had died because of medication errors the hospital refused to acknowledge. 7 families who still didn't know why their loved ones had unexpectedly deteriorated. 7 lives that might have been saved if someone had listened. When Sandra picked her up, Maya was already waiting outside her apartment building, dressed in her most professional navy suit, her hair neatly braided and pinned up. "You ready?" Sandra asked, eyeing Maya's exhausted face with concern. "As ready as I'll ever be," Maya replied, clutching her folder like a shield. The courthouse seemed more imposing in the morning light. News of the case had spread, and a small crowd of spectators had gathered, including several nurses from other hospitals who had come to show solidarity. Maya nodded gratefully at their encouraging smiles. Inside, Richard Grayson and his team were already seated, looking fresh and confident. Maya noticed 2 new additions to their table, Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the hospital's IT director, and a man she didn't recognize, likely a technical expert brought in to counter her claims about the system. Judge Harrison called the court to order precisely at 9 a.m. "Ms. Wilson, you may call your first witness." "The plaintiff calls Maya Johnson," Sandra announced. Maya's legs felt wooden as she walked to the witness stand. After being sworn in, she looked out at the courtroom, meeting the skeptical gazes of the jury. She reminded herself that she had truth on her side, even if it seemed the whole world was aligned against her. Sandra started gently, establishing Maya's credentials and exemplary work history: 15 years at Westfield, advanced certifications in emergency nursing and critical care, 4 commendations for exceptional patient care, not a single disciplinary action until after she reported the medication system errors. "Ms. Johnson, can you tell us what you observed about the new digital medication system after it was implemented in April 3 years ago?" Sandra asked. Maya took a deep breath and began the testimony she had rehearsed countless times. The new system was designed to calculate medication dosages based on patient weight, age, and kidney function. But I noticed that for certain medications, particularly high-risk drugs like heparin and vancomycin, the system wasn't properly adjusting for patients with impaired kidney function. And what was the potential impact of this error? Patients with kidney impairment could receive doses that were too high, leading to toxicity, internal bleeding, and potentially death. What did you do when you noticed this issue? I followed protocol. First, I documented the specific cases where I'd observed problems. Then I reported my concerns to my immediate supervisor, nurse manager Helen Davis. When nothing changed after 2 weeks, I elevated my concern to Dr. Phillips, the medical director. And what was the response? Maya's voice remained steady. Initially, they said they would look into it. But weeks passed, and nothing changed. Meanwhile, I was observing patterns of unexpected patient deterioration consistent with medication toxicity. Sandra guided her through the timeline, her repeated reports, the growing evidence, and the eventual retaliation. As Maya spoke, she could see several jurors leaning forward, their expressions shifting from skepticism to concern. After my third report to administration, things changed, Maya continued. Suddenly, I was written up for tardiness, even though I'd arrived at the same time I had for years. Then I was accused of medication errors I know I didn't make. My shifts were changed with no notice. I was moved from the emergency department to a general medical floor where I had less access to the system data. Objection, Grayson interrupted. The witness is speculating about motivation. Sustained, Judge Harrison said. Stick to the facts, Ms. Johnson. Maya nodded and continued, describing how she had begun keeping meticulous personal records of patient cases and system issues, sensing that something wasn't right. And then what happened? Sandra prompted. In June, 3 months after the system was implemented, I treated a patient, a 67-year-old woman with kidney disease. The system calculated a heparin dose that I recognized as dangerously high. I questioned it, and the attending physician reduced the dose based on my concern. The next day, I discovered that both the original order and my documentation of the incident had been altered in the system. The dangerous dosage was gone, replaced with the correct calculation, making it appear as if the system had worked properly all along. Objection! Grayson was on his feet. This is pure speculation. Ms. Johnson has no way of knowing if the system was altered. Your Honor, Sandra countered. Ms. Johnson personally entered the original documentation and witnessed the changes. I'll allow it, but tread carefully, Judge Harrison warned. Maya continued, describing how she had begun taking screenshots of the medication orders before and after, building a record of the alterations. When she presented this evidence to hospital administration, she was placed on administrative leave the next day. 2 weeks later, she was terminated. Did they give a reason for your termination? Sandra asked. They claimed I had made repeated medication errors and had become paranoid about the new system. They said my allegations were damaging to hospital morale and reputation. When Sandra finished her direct examination, Richard Grayson approached the stand, his expression one of practiced sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. Ms. Johnson, you were a nurse for 15 years, correct? Yes? Not a software engineer? Not an IT specialist? No, but... Just a simple yes or no, please, Grayson interrupted. You have no formal training in computer systems or digital security. No. Yet you claim to understand the intricate workings of a sophisticated medical record system better than the experts who designed it? Maya felt her temper flare. I understand what I saw with my own eyes. What you think you saw, Grayson corrected smoothly. Isn't it possible that in the stress of adapting to a new system, you simply made mistakes in your documentation? No. Isn't it true that after receiving your first negative performance review in 15 years, you became fixated on finding flaws in the system rather than addressing your own performance issues? The negative review came after I reported the problems, Maya countered, fighting to keep her voice steady. Grayson's questioning continued relentlessly, painting her as a once competent nurse who couldn't adapt to technological change, who became paranoid and started making unfounded accusations to cover her own mistakes. With each question, Maya felt the jury's earlier sympathy wavering. Finally, Grayson held up a printout of her performance review. This review, dated 2 weeks before your first complaint about the system, notes that you were resistant to digital documentation processes and made repeated errors in medication recording. How do you explain that? Maya felt the blood drain from her face. That's not possible. My review was in May after I reported the issues in April. Someone changed the date. Grayson's smile was cold. A convenient claim, but you have no proof. I do have proof, Maya said firmly. Sandra stood immediately. Your Honor, may we approach the bench? After a brief sidebar, Judge Harrison addressed the court. We'll take a 15-minute recess. In a small conference room, Maya faced Sandra with shaking hands. They changed the dates on my performance review. They're going to make it look like I'm lying about everything. We expected this, Sandra reminded her. That's why we have Dr. Robertson ready to testify. He's analyzed the metadata of the hospital records and can prove the alterations. What if it's not enough? These people have power, connections. They've covered this up for 3 years already. Sandra squeezed her shoulder. Trust the process, Maya. The truth has a way of coming out. But as Maya returned to the courtroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that truth alone might not be enough. Not against an opponent who could alter reality with a few keystrokes, who had the resources to create whatever narrative served their interests. As she retook the stand, preparing for more of Grayson's questioning, Maya knew that somewhere in the courthouse, someone was watching who had the power to end this charade, if only she could make them see what was really at stake. When the court reconvened, Richard Grayson continued his cross-examination with renewed vigor, his questions designed to unravel Maya's credibility thread by thread. Ms. Johnson, you testified that you took screenshots of the medication orders before and after they were allegedly altered. Where are these screenshots now? Maya met his gaze steadily. They were on my work computer, which was confiscated when I was placed on administrative leave. I also had copies on a USB drive that was in my locker at the hospital. A convenient explanation for their absence, Grayson noted with a slight smile. Did you ever show these supposed screenshots to anyone else? Yes. I showed them to Nurse Davies and Dr. Patel. Both confirmed what I saw. Yet neither has come forward to support your claims. Nurse Davies was transferred to another facility shortly after I was terminated. Dr. Patel's fellowship contract wasn't renewed, despite his exemplary record. Grayson's expression remained skeptical. So you're suggesting that anyone who might corroborate your story has been silenced by this vast conspiracy? Objection, Sandra interjected. Counsel is editorializing. Sustained, Judge Harrison said, though his tone suggested limited patience. Grayson changed tactics. Ms. Johnson, in your 15 years at Westfield, did you ever have conflicts with hospital administration before this incident? Maya hesitated, knowing the trap. I advocated for patient safety improvements several times, including a rather heated exchange with Dr. Phillips 3 years before your termination regarding staffing levels in the emergency department. I wouldn't characterize it as heated. I expressed concern that patient safety was being compromised. Dr. Phillips's notes indicate you were combative and unprofessional. Isn't it possible that your history of confrontation with administration colored their perception of your complaints about the new system? Maya felt her composure slipping. I was never unprofessional. I was advocating for patient safety, which was my duty as a nurse. Your duty, Grayson repeated, his tone making the words sound like an accusation. No further questions, Your Honor. As Maya returned to her seat, she felt drained. Grayson had skillfully planted seeds of doubt, portraying her as a troublemaker with a personal vendetta against hospital leadership. Sandra squeezed her hand under the table. You did well, she whispered. Now we bring in the big guns. The plaintiff calls Dr. James Robertson, Sandra announced. A distinguished man in his early 60s approached the stand. His silver hair and bow tie gave him an air of academic authority that immediately commanded attention. After establishing his credentials, Ph.D. in computer science from MIT, 20 years as a digital forensics expert for the FBI, now a professor at the State University, Sandra got straight to the point. Dr. Robertson, You were asked to analyze the digital records from Westfield Medical Center system. What did you find? Dr. Robertson adjusted his glasses. I reviewed both the official records provided during discovery and the backup server data obtained through court order. My analysis revealed systematic manipulation of the digital records. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Maya noticed Grayson whispering urgently to one of his colleagues. Please explain what you mean by manipulation, Sandra prompted. The hospital's digital system creates multiple timestamps for each entry, the visible timestamp that users see, and several background timestamps embedded in the metadata that track when records are created, accessed, and modified. In numerous instances, I found discrepancies between these timestamps. Dr. Robertson turned to the jury, his manner that of a professor explaining a complex concept to students. Think of it like a letter with both a visible date at the top and a postmark on the envelope. If the visible date says January 1st, but the postmark shows January 10th, we know something isn't right. And what specific discrepancies did you find? Sandra asked. In Ms. Johnson's performance reviews, the visible dates showed they were created before she reported system issues, but the metadata timestamps reveal they were actually created weeks later and backdated. Similarly, patient medication orders showing correct dosages have metadata indicating they were modified hours or days after the initial orders were entered. Grayson was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Dr. Robertson's analysis is based on data obtained through improper channels. The backup server data was obtained through proper court order, Your Honor, Sandra countered, as documented in your ruling of March 15th. Judge Harrison nodded. Objection overruled. Continue, Dr. Robertson. Most concerning, Dr. Robertson continued, I found evidence of a systematic process for altering records. There's a specific digital signature associated with these changes, a pattern that indicates they were made using administrative override credentials, not through normal medical staff access. Could these discrepancies be the result of system glitches or routine maintenance? Sandra asked. No. The pattern is too consistent, too targeted. These changes specifically affected records related to the patients Ms. Johnson identified as receiving incorrect medication dosages, as well as her own performance evaluations and documentation. This wasn't random system behavior. Sandra displayed a series of technical diagrams on the courtroom screen. Dr. Robertson, could you explain what we're seeing here? These are visual representations of the metadata trails. The red highlights indicate where visible data and background timestamps don't match. As you can see, these discrepancies appear consistently in records related to 7 specific patients and in Ms. Johnson's performance evaluations. For the next hour, Dr. Robertson methodically walked the jury through his findings, translating complex digital forensics into understandable examples. Maya watched the jurors' faces, seeing confusion give way to understanding and then to concern. When Sandra finished her questioning, Grayson approached the stand, his earlier confidence noticeably dimmed. Dr. Robertson, isn't it possible that what you're interpreting as deliberate manipulation could be explained by routine system updates or automatic data reconciliation processes? No, Dr. Robertson replied firmly. I considered those possibilities and ruled them out. Routine processes would affect all records, not just those related to specific patients and Ms. Johnson. The pattern is too targeted to be coincidental. Grayson tried several angles to undermine Dr. Robertson's testimony, but the expert calmly refuted each suggestion, his academic demeanor making Grayson's aggressive questioning seem increasingly desperate. When Grayson finally returned to his seat, Maya could see the hospital's legal team huddled in urgent consultation. For the first time since the trial began, they looked worried. Sandra called her next witness, Dr. Amir Patel, the young physician who had worked with Maya in the emergency department. His appearance caused visible surprise among the hospital's team, Clearly, they hadn't expected him to testify. "Dr. Patel, could you describe your working relationship with Maya Johnson?" Sandra began. "I worked with Nurse Johnson for approximately 2 years in the emergency department. She was one of the most competent nurses I'd ever encountered, thorough, knowledgeable, and deeply committed to patient safety." "Did she ever discuss concerns about the new medication system with you?" "Yes. About 3 months after the system was implemented, she showed me discrepancies she had documented between the system's recommended dosages and what was clinically appropriate for patients with kidney impairment." "And what was your reaction to these concerns?" "I shared them. I had noticed similar issues but assumed they were isolated incidents. Maya's documentation showed a pattern that was deeply concerning." "Did you report these concerns to hospital administration?" Dr. Patel's expression tightened. "I did. I spoke with Dr. Phillips and was told the system had been thoroughly vetted and that any perceived issues were due to user error, not system flaws." "What happened after you reported these concerns?" 2 weeks later, I was informed that my fellowship contract would not be renewed, despite previously receiving excellent evaluations. No explanation was provided. As Dr. Patel continued his testimony, Maya felt a surge of hope. The truth was finally emerging, piece by piece. But she knew that the hospital still had powerful witnesses to call, and the most critical evidence, the evidence that had taken her 3 years to obtain, was still waiting to be revealed. At the day's end, as Maya and Sandra gathered their materials, Maya noticed a woman she didn't recognize sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching intently. The woman was in her 50s, elegantly dressed, her expression unreadable. "Who is that?" Maya whispered to Sandra. Sandra glanced up, then quickly away. "That's Catherine Westfield, the hospital board chairwoman." Maya felt a chill. Catherine Westfield rarely appeared in public, yet here she was watching the trial. Her presence suggested that the stakes were even higher than Maya had realized. "Why would she be here?" Maya asked. "I don't know," Sandra admitted. "But it can't be good for their side that she felt the need to observe personally." As they left the courtroom, Maya felt Catherine Westfield's eyes following her. Tomorrow would bring the hospital's expert witnesses, their chance to counter Dr. Robertson's damning testimony. But for the first time since the trial began, Maya felt the balance shifting. The truth was fighting its way to the surface, one witness at a time. The third day of trial brought an atmosphere of heightened tension. News of Dr. Robertson's testimony had spread, drawing more spectators and media to the courthouse. Maya spotted several hospital board members seated behind the defense table, their expressions grim. Catherine Westfield had taken a more prominent position today, seated directly behind Richard Grayson. Her steely gaze surveyed the courtroom like a general assessing a battlefield. "The defense calls Dr. Elizabeth Chen," Grayson announced as proceedings began. Dr. Chen, the hospital's IT director, approached the stand with confident steps. Impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, her credentials were formidable. Double PhD in medical informatics and computer science, designer of health information systems used in hospitals nationwide. "Dr. Chen, please explain your role in implementing Westfield's digital medication system," Grayson began. "I oversaw the entire implementation process," Dr. Chen replied, her voice clear and authoritative. "This included system selection, customization, testing, staff training, and post-implementation monitoring." "And what safeguards were built into this system to prevent the kind of errors Ms. Johnson has alleged?" "Multiple redundancies," Dr. Chen explained, turning slightly to address the jury directly. "The system includes 3 separate verification algorithms for medication dosing. It flags any unusual dosages and requires provider confirmation. Every change is logged with user identification and timestamp. It's virtually impossible for the system to calculate incorrect dosages without triggering alerts." Maya fought to keep her expression neutral as Dr. Chen continued, describing the system's sophistication in technical terms that clearly impressed the jury. Could the system be manipulated in the manner Dr. Robertson suggested? Grayson asked. Absolutely not, Dr. Chen stated firmly. The metadata Dr. Robertson analyzed comes from backup files that lack integrity verification. In layman's terms, backup data can become corrupted in storage, creating the appearance of discrepancies where none actually exist. Grayson guided Dr. Chen through a detailed explanation of alternative explanations for the timestamp discrepancies, system updates, automatic reconciliation processes, routine maintenance. For each issue Dr. Robertson had identified, Dr. Chen offered a technical, seemingly plausible explanation that made Maya's allegations appear to be misunderstandings. In your professional opinion, Grayson concluded, is there any merit to the claim that patient records or performance evaluations were deliberately altered? None whatsoever, Dr. Chen responded without hesitation. What we're seeing is a fundamental misunderstanding of how medical information systems function, combined with corrupted backup data that creates illusory discrepancies. When Sandra rose for cross-examination, Maya could see the challenge ahead. Dr. Chen was not only knowledgeable but smooth and composed, a far cry from the defensive administrators who had testified earlier. Dr. Chen, you testified that the system includes multiple safeguards against medication errors. Were you aware of any reported concerns about medication calculations prior to Ms. Johnson's termination? There were the usual adjustment issues during implementation, but nothing systemic. Nothing systemic, Sandra repeated. I'd like to show you Exhibit 27, please. The courtroom deputy handed Dr. Chen a document. Maya recognized it as an internal email she had discovered during her investigation. An email Dr. Chen herself had sent to the system vendor 6 weeks after implementation. Dr. Chen, is this an email you sent to Meditech Solutions on May 17th, 3 years ago? Dr. Chen scanned the document, her composure slipping momentarily. Yes, it appears to be. Could you read the highlighted portion, please? Dr. Chen cleared her throat. We're seeing concerning patterns in the GFR adjustment calculations for high-risk medications. Please advise on potential recalibration options. This needs immediate attention. GFR refers to glomerular filtration rate, a measure of kidney function, correct? Yes. So approximately 6 weeks after system implementation, you yourself raised concerns about the exact issue Ms. Johnson identified, medication calculations for patients with kidney impairment. Isn't that true? Dr. Chen's expression tightened. This was a routine inquiry during system optimization. Yet you testified moments ago that there were no systemic issues reported. Which statement is accurate, Dr. Chen? This email doesn't indicate a systemic problem. It was a technical clarification request. Sandra approached the witness stand. Dr. Chen, are you aware of any patient deaths potentially linked to medication errors during this period? Grayson was immediately on his feet. Objection. Counsel is making inflammatory suggestions without foundation. Your Honor, Sandra countered. Dr. Chen's awareness of adverse outcomes directly relates to her testimony about system safety. Judge Harrison considered briefly. I'll allow it, but tread carefully, counselor. Sandra repeated her question. Dr. Chen hesitated, visibly calculating her response. I was made aware of several unexpected patient deteriorations, but there was no established causal link to medication errors. No established causal link, Sandra echoed. Was that because no one was permitted to investigate such a link? Objection, Grayson shouted. Sustained, Judge Harrison ruled. Ms. Wilson, no editorializing. Sandra changed tactics. Dr. Chen, are you familiar with something called an administrative override in your system? Yes, it's a function that allows authorized administrators to correct errors or inconsistencies in the database. Who has access to this administrative override? Myself, the deputy IT director, and 2 senior system analysts. No one else? Not Dr. Phillips? Not anyone from hospital administration? Dr. Chen hesitated again. The hospital CEO and medical director have emergency access credentials, but those are rarely used. Rarely, but not never, Sandra noted. And would these administrative overrides leave the specific digital signature that Dr. Robertson identified in his analysis? I would have to review his specific findings to answer that. Fortunately, we have them right here, Sandra said, displaying Dr. Robertson's technical diagrams on the courtroom screen. Do these patterns match the digital signature of an administrative override, Dr. Chen? Dr. Chen studied the screen, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. They bear some similarities, but yes or no, Dr. Chen? Do these patterns match administrative override signatures? Yes, but context matters. Thank you, Sandra interrupted. No further questions. As Dr. Chen stepped down, Maya could see Catherine Westfield leaning forward to whisper something to Grayson, who nodded grimly. The defense's next witness was Dr. Harold Bennett, a nationally recognized expert in medical information systems. Where Dr. Chen had been precise and technical, Dr. Bennett was avuncular and engaging, explaining complex concepts with folksy metaphors that resonated with the jury. In my 40 years of experience, he explained, leaning toward the jury conspiratorially, I've never seen a case where the simplest explanation wasn't the correct one. Massive conspiracy requiring multiple people coordinating to alter records? Or a disgruntled employee misinterpreting normal system functions? Occam's razor applies in technology just as it does elsewhere. Despite Sandra's pointed cross-examination, Dr. Bennett maintained his affable certainty, dismissing Dr. Robertson's findings as academically interesting but practically implausible. By late afternoon, Maya felt the momentum shifting back toward the hospital. The jury seemed swayed by the technical explanations, and Judge Harrison's questions indicated growing skepticism toward their case. During the final recess, Maya confronted Sandra in the hallway. "They're winning," she whispered urgently. "The jury believes them." "Not yet," Sandra countered. "We still have our strongest evidence." "The thumb drive isn't enough," Maya insisted. "They'll say it was tampered with, that I fabricated the evidence." "Then we need someone from inside," Sandra admitted. "Someone who can corroborate what's on that drive." Maya's mind raced through possibilities. Most of her former colleagues were too afraid to come forward, their livelihoods dependent on the hospital's good graces. But perhaps there was someone with nothing left to lose. As they re-entered the courtroom, Maya's attention was drawn to Catherine Westfield, who was now speaking intently with Dr. Phillips. Something about their interaction struck Maya as odd. Not the collaboration of board chair and medical director, but something more personal, more urgent. When court resumed, the defense called their final witness of the day, Henry Gibson, the hospital's chief financial officer. His testimony focused on the financial impact of Maya's baseless allegations, painting her as a disgruntled former employee whose claims had damaged the hospital's reputation and diverted resources from patient care. As Gibson spoke, Maya noticed Catherine Westfield checking her phone, her expression changing from confidence to something that looked remarkably like fear. Whatever message she had received, it had clearly unsettled her. Maya leaned toward Sandra. "Something's happening," she whispered. "Look at Westfield." Sandra glanced discreetly at the board chairwoman, who was now urgently texting, her fingers flying over her phone screen. "Whatever it is," Sandra whispered back, "we need to stay focused. Tomorrow is our last chance to make our case before closing arguments." Maya nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that an unexpected variable had entered the equation, one that might change everything. Maya arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual the next morning, hoping to center herself before the day's proceedings. She found Sandra already in the conference room, surrounded by documents, her expression uncharacteristically animated. "Something's happened," Sandra said without preamble, pushing a manila folder across the table. "This was delivered to my office last night. Anonymous package, no return address." Maya opened the folder with trembling fingers. Inside were printouts of internal hospital emails, system logs, and, most shocking, minutes from a secret board meeting held 3 weeks after she'd first reported the medication system issues. "These are authentic," she whispered, scanning the documents. "This is exactly what we needed. Proof that they knew about the problems and deliberately covered them up instead of fixing them." Sandra nodded, her expression cautious. "If they're authentic, yes. But we need to be careful. This could be a trap. Forged documents designed to undermine our credibility if we present them." "They're not forged," Maya insisted, pointing to specific details. "Look at this notation in Dr. Phillips's handwriting. And this reference to patient 457B, that was Mrs. Garcia, the woman I specifically warned them about before she died from heparin toxicity." Sandra studied the documents more closely. "The question is, who sent them? And why now?" Maya thought back to Catherine Westfield's strange behavior the previous afternoon, the text message that had clearly rattled her. "Someone on the inside is getting nervous," she suggested. "Maybe they're worried about being implicated when the truth comes out." Before Sandra could respond, there was a knock at the conference room door. The bailiff entered, looking uncomfortable. "Ms. Wilson, there's someone here who insists on speaking with you and Ms. Johnson. She says it's urgent and relates to the case." Sandra glanced at Maya, then nodded. "Send them in." Maya gasped when Helen Davis entered the room. Her former nurse manager looked 10 years older than when Maya had last seen her, her face drawn, her hands fidgeting nervously with her purse strap. "Helen, what are you doing here?" Helen's eyes darted to the bailiff, who still stood at the door. "Could we speak privately, please?" Once the bailiff had gone, Helen sank into a chair, exhaling shakily. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep pretending I don't know what happened." "You sent the documents," Sandra guessed. Helen nodded. "I kept copies of everything. After they transferred me to the satellite clinic, effectively a demotion, I knew I might need protection someday." She turned to Maya, her eyes brimming with tears. "I should have stood up for you 3 years ago. I was a coward." "You were protecting yourself," Maya said gently. "I understand." "No, you don't," Helen insisted. "It's worse than you know. The system errors weren't just oversights. They were deliberately ignored because fixing them would have cost millions and delayed the hospital's accreditation review. 7 people died because of a business decision." Sandra leaned forward. "Ms. Davis, are you willing to testify to this?" Helen hesitated, visibly struggling with the decision. "If I do, my career in healthcare is over. They'll make sure of it." "People died, Helen," Maya said quietly. "Families deserve to know why." Helen closed her eyes briefly, then straightened her shoulders. "Yes, I'll testify, but there's something else you should know." She lowered her voice further. Catherine Westfield's son was the lead developer on the medication system. His company, Meditech Solutions, won the contract despite more qualified competitors. The board meeting minutes won't show it, but everyone knew it was a sweetheart deal. Maya and Sandra exchanged shocked glances. This explained Catherine's personal stake in the case. It wasn't just about hospital liability, but potential criminal charges for her son. That's why she's been in court, Maya realized. She's not just protecting the hospital, she's protecting her family. Helen nodded grimly. When you started gathering evidence about the system flaws, you weren't just threatening the hospital's reputation. You were threatening her son's company, which has since signed contracts with 6 other major hospital systems. Sandra quickly incorporated this new information into their strategy, prepping Helen for testimony while Maya reviewed the documents, identifying the most damning evidence. When court convened an hour later, the energy in the room had shifted palpably, something the defense team immediately sensed. Richard Grayson approached the bench before proceedings officially began, requesting a sidebar with the judge. After a brief, heated discussion that the gallery couldn't hear, Judge Harrison addressed the court. "Mr. Grayson has informed me that the defense has a new settlement offer they wish to present to the plaintiff. We'll recess for 30 minutes to allow for these discussions." In the conference room, Grayson presented their offer with none of his previous condescension. $2 million, a confidential settlement with no admission of wrongdoing, and a neutral reference for future employment. "No," Maya said immediately. "Ms. Johnson," Grayson said, dropping his voice, "be reasonable. This is a generous offer that guarantees you compensation without the risk of losing at trial." "This was never about money," Maya replied. "It's about accountability. 7 families don't know why their loved ones died." $3 million, Grayson countered. "And we'll implement a full system review by an independent auditor." Sandra looked to Maya, who shook her head firmly. "We're not settling," Sandra informed him. "And when we return to court, we'll be calling a surprise witness." Grayson's face darkened. "Who?" "You'll find out with everyone else," Sandra replied coolly. When court resumed, the gallery buzzed with speculation. Catherine Westfield had moved to the edge of her seat, her usual composure visibly strained. "The plaintiff calls Helen Davis," Sandra announced. A ripple of surprise ran through the courtroom as Helen walked to the witness stand. Maya could see the hospital's legal team frantically whispering among themselves, clearly blindsided by this development. Helen's testimony was devastating in its clarity. She described the initial reports of system errors, the concerns raised by Maya and other staff, and the deliberate decision to ignore these warnings. Dr. Phillips explicitly said that delaying the system launch would jeopardize the hospital's accreditation timeline, Helen testified. "When I asked about patient safety, he told me that the financial consequences of missing the accreditation window were too significant to consider alternatives." "And what happened to the patients affected by these medication errors?" Sandra asked. 7 patients died from complications consistent with medication toxicity. 3 others suffered permanent organ damage. All of these cases were classified as unexpected complications rather than adverse events that would require reporting to regulatory agencies. "What happened after Ms. Johnson reported these concerns?" "There was a meeting, not in the official minutes, but a separate discussion where Dr. Phillips and Catherine Westfield decided that Maya needed to be, in their words, managed out of the organization. They began building a case against her, altering performance reviews and creating documentation of errors that never occurred." As Helen continued her testimony, Maya watched the jury's expressions transform from skepticism to shock and then to outrage. Even Judge Harrison, who had seemed to favor the defense, was leaning forward, his brow furrowed in concern. When Sandra introduced the documents Helen had provided, showing the deliberate cover-up in the hospital's own words, Grayson's objections grew increasingly desperate. Judge Harrison overruled most of them, allowing the damning evidence to be entered into the record. During cross-examination, Grayson attempted to paint Helen as a disgruntled employee acting out of personal grievance, but her calm recitation of specific dates, names, and events undermined his efforts. "Ms. Davis, why didn't you come forward with these allegations earlier?" Grayson demanded. "Because I was afraid," Helen admitted simply. "I have a daughter in college and a mother in assisted living. I'm their only support. The hospital made it very clear what happens to people who speak up. I watched what they did to Maya." By the end of Helen's testimony, the atmosphere in the courtroom had transformed. The hospital's defense, which had seemed so formidable just days earlier, now appeared to be crumbling. During the afternoon recess, Maya spotted Dr. Phillips in heated conversation with Catherine Westfield, their faces tense with barely controlled panic. "They're turning on each other," Sandra observed quietly. "This is when the truth really starts to emerge." As they prepared to return to the courtroom for the final witness of the day, Maya felt a weight lifting. Not just the burden of her 3-year fight for justice, but the deeper pain of having been disbelieved, discredited, and discarded for doing what she knew was right. "Whatever happens next," she told Sandra, "we've already won. The truth is out there now. They can't bury it again." The courtroom atmosphere had transformed completely by the time proceedings resumed. The hospital's legal team huddled in urgent consultation, their earlier confidence replaced by visible concern. 2 more board members had arrived during the recess, their presence underscoring the escalating stakes. Maya noticed a man in the back row she hadn't seen before, sharply dressed, tense, watching Catherine Westfield rather than the proceedings. "Her son," Helen whispered, following Maya's gaze. "That's Thomas Westfield, CEO of Meditech Solutions." The implications weren't lost on Maya. If the case exposed deliberate flaws in the medication system, Thomas Westfield's company faced not just the loss of the Westfield Medical Center contract, but potentially all their hospital clients nationwide. "The plaintiff calls Dr. Rajiv Patel," Sandra announced, bringing Maya's attention back to the front of the courtroom. Dr. Patel approached the stand with measured steps. Unlike during his previous testimony, he now carried a thick folder of his own. After being sworn in, he turned to face the jury directly. "Dr. Patel," Sandra began, "you previously testified about your observations of the medication system errors and the hospital's response to those concerns. Do you have additional information to share with the court?" "Yes," he replied, his voice steady. "After my testimony yesterday, I received a call from a colleague at University Hospital who read about this case in the news. He reminded me of data I had collected during my fellowship, but had set aside after my contract wasn't renewed." Sandra approached the witness stand. "What kind of data?" "I was conducting a research study on medication errors in emergency settings. When Maya, Nurse Johnson, raised concerns about the new system, I began tracking specific metrics for patients receiving the medications in question. I compared outcomes before and after the system implementation." "And what did you find?" "A statistically significant increase in adverse outcomes for patients with renal impairment who received medications like heparin and vancomycin after the new system was implemented. The mortality rate for these patients increased by 26%. The courtroom fell completely silent. Maya could see jurors leaning forward, their expressions intent. "Did you report these findings?" Sandra asked. "I presented them to Dr. Phillips in a formal research summary," Dr. Patel confirmed. "He told me the data was flawed and ordered me to abandon the research line. When I persisted, suggesting we at least investigate further, I was removed from the research committee. 2 weeks later, I was informed my fellowship contract wouldn't be renewed." "Dr. Patel, do you have documentation of this research?" "Yes." He opened the folder he had brought with him. "These are my original data sets, statistical analyses, and the formal report I submitted to Dr. Phillips." As Sandra entered the documents into evidence, Richard Grayson rose to object, but his arguments sounded increasingly hollow. Judge Harrison overruled him, allowing the damning research to be admitted. During cross-examination, Grayson attempted to undermine Dr. Patel's credibility, suggesting his research was methodologically flawed and motivated by disappointment over his non-renewal. "Isn't it true that your fellowship evaluation noted concerns about your research methodologies?" Grayson pressed. "That evaluation was written after I presented these findings," Dr. Patel replied calmly. "My previous evaluations, which I've provided to the court, were uniformly excellent. Maya watched Catherine Westfield during this exchange. The hospital board chair was now openly texting, her expression grim. Thomas Westfield had moved closer to the front, sitting directly behind his mother, occasionally leaning forward to whisper in her ear. After Dr. Patel's testimony, Sandra called their final witness, Jacob Reynolds, a former IT specialist from the hospital who had been part of the system implementation team. "Mr. Reynolds, what was your role in implementing the medication system?" Sandra asked. "I was a senior systems analyst, responsible for integration testing and security protocols," he replied, his voice betraying nervousness. "During this process, did you identify any concerns with the system's medication calculation algorithms?" "Yes. During final testing, I flagged multiple instances where the system failed to properly adjust dosages for patients with impaired kidney function." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "I documented these issues and submitted them to Dr. Chen with a recommendation to delay implementation until they were resolved." "What happened next?" "Dr. Chen told me the issues would be addressed in a post-implementation update. When I expressed concern about patient safety in the interim, she said—" He hesitated, glancing at the defense table. "She said the hospital couldn't afford any delays and that the risk was statistically acceptable." "Statistically acceptable," Sandra repeated. "Did she explain what that meant?" "She said that based on patient volume and the specific conditions required for adverse events, they anticipated fewer than 10 serious incidents before the update could be implemented. She called it acceptable collateral damage." A murmur of shock rippled through the courtroom. Maya saw several jurors visibly recoil. What happened after the system went live? When nurses like Ms. Johnson began reporting the exact issues I had flagged, I reminded Dr. Chen of my original warnings. She instructed me to focus on my assigned tasks and not to discuss my previous concerns with anyone. And then? 2 months later, I was laid off as part of what they called a restructuring. 23 IT staff were let go, most of whom had been involved in the system implementation. As Reynolds continued his testimony, Maya felt a complex mix of emotions. Vindication, certainly, but also fresh anger at how systematically the hospital had silenced everyone who tried to prevent these tragedies. During a brief recess, Sandra pulled Maya aside, her expression cautiously triumphant. "The defense is crumbling. I've received 3 messages from Grayson already, each with an increased settlement offer." "I'm not settling," Maya insisted. "Not now." "I know," Sandra replied. "I haven't even responded, but it shows they're panicking." When court resumed, the shift in power dynamics was palpable. Catherine Westfield had moved to sit at the defense table itself, whispering urgently to Grayson throughout the proceedings. Her son had disappeared from the gallery. The final hours of testimony brought forward the system audit logs that Helen Davis had preserved, showing exactly when and how patient records had been altered. Dr. Robertson returned to walk the jury through this new evidence, connecting the timestamps to specific administrator credentials assigned to Dr. Phillips and Dr. Chen. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, Judge Harrison addressed both legal teams. "In light of today's testimony, I'm instructing both parties to prepare for closing arguments tomorrow morning. Additionally," he fixed the defense table with a stern gaze, "I am referring the evidence presented today to the District Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal charges. This court takes very seriously the allegations of deliberate record falsification and potential corporate negligence resulting in patient deaths." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Catherine Westfield's face had gone ashen. In the hallway afterward, Maya found herself surrounded by reporters shouting questions. She declined to comment, following Sandra toward the exit, but stopped when she heard her name called from behind. Turning, she found herself face to face with Diane Garcia, the daughter of one of the patients who had died from medication errors. Maya had reached out to the families during her investigation, but most had been reluctant to get involved, uncertain about what had really happened to their loved ones. "I just wanted to say thank you," Diane said, her eyes brimming with tears. "For 3 years, they told me my mother's death was just an unfortunate complication. I finally know the truth." Maya embraced her, her own composure threatening to break. "I'm so sorry about your mother." "You risked everything to expose what happened," Diane said. "The other families and we want to be here tomorrow for the closing arguments." As Maya drove home that evening, she felt a shifting within herself, the tight knot of anger and vindication loosening, making space for something that felt remarkably like peace. The truth was emerging, not just for her but for the families who had lost loved ones. Her phone rang repeatedly, journalists seeking comments, former colleagues expressing support now that the tide had turned, even a hospital board member suggesting a private conversation. She ignored them all, needing time to process the day's events. At home, she sat on her small balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to think beyond the case, beyond the all-consuming fight for justice. Whatever happened tomorrow, the truth was now a matter of public record. It could no longer be buried or denied. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sandra. Grayson called again. 10 minutes. Public apology, system recall, still saying no? Maya smiled as she typed her response. Still no. Some things aren't for sale. The final day of trial dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within the courthouse. Maya arrived to find the hallway packed with spectators, healthcare workers, patient advocates, and family members of the deceased patients, all drawn by news reports of the previous day's explosive testimony. The families had organized overnight, arriving together wearing matching purple ribbons, the color symbolizing patient safety. Diane Garcia had coordinated the effort, creating a silent but powerful visual statement about the human cost of the hospital's negligence. Maya's throat tightened at the sight of them filing into the courtroom, filling the first 3 rows directly behind her table. Inside, the transformation of the defense team was striking. 2 additional attorneys had joined Grayson overnight, and Catherine Westfield was now officially seated at their table, her expression taut with strain. Thomas Westfield was nowhere to be seen. "They've brought in crisis management," Sandra whispered, nodding toward the new attorneys. "Gerald Hoffman is a specialist in damage control for corporate disasters." Before proceedings began, Judge Harrison called both legal teams to his chambers. His expression was grave as they gathered around the small conference table. "I've received 3 separate motions since court adjourned yesterday," he began without preamble. "The defense has moved for a mistrial based on the late introduction of evidence. The district attorney's office has filed a motion to preserve all evidence for potential criminal proceedings. And most unusually, I've received an amicus brief from the state medical board expressing concern about patient safety implications statewide." He fixed Grayson with a stern look. "I'm denying your motion for a mistrial, Mr. Grayson. The evidence presented yesterday was properly authenticated and directly relevant to the plaintiff's claims." Grayson began to protest, but Judge Harrison held up his hand. "I understand your position, Counselor, but my ruling stands. As for the DA's motion, I'm granting it. All evidence presented in this trial will be preserved for potential criminal investigation." Maya felt a surge of validation. This was no longer just about her wrongful termination. It had become about accountability for preventable deaths. "Now," Judge Harrison continued, "I understand settlement discussions have been ongoing. Have the parties reached any agreement?" "No, Your Honor," Sandra replied. "The plaintiff is not interested in a confidential settlement." Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "Very well. We'll proceed with closing arguments. But I want to be clear. The testimony presented yesterday raises serious concerns about public safety. My ruling will reflect those concerns." When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Judge Harrison called for closing arguments, and Sandra rose to address the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice measured and clear. "This case began as one woman's fight for justice after being wrongfully terminated. But as you've witnessed over the past 4 days, it has revealed something far more disturbing: a systemic failure of ethics, accountability, and basic human decency." Sandra moved to stand beside Maya, placing a hand on her shoulder. Maya Johnson did exactly what a nurse is supposed to do. When she identified a serious risk to patient safety, she reported it through proper channels. She documented her concerns. She advocated for vulnerable patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. She walked slowly toward the jury box, making eye contact with each juror in turn. And how was she rewarded for this diligence? With fabricated performance issues, with altered records, with character assassination, with the destruction of a career she had built over 15 years of exemplary service. Sandra gestured toward the families seated behind them. But Maya Johnson's suffering, significant as it is, pales in comparison to the suffering of these families. 7 patients died because Westfield Medical Center chose profit over safety. Because they decided that fixing a flawed system would cost too much, delay their accreditation, and embarrass the CEO's son, whose company created the flawed software. She returned to the evidence, methodically walking the jury through the timeline of events: Maya's initial reports, the hospital's awareness of the problems, the deliberate decision to ignore the warnings, and the coordinated effort to silence anyone who spoke up. "The evidence is irrefutable," Sandra concluded. "The timestamps don't lie. The metadata doesn't lie. The pattern of adverse patient outcomes doesn't lie. And the parade of witnesses, former employees who risked their futures to testify, they didn't lie either." She paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle over the courtroom. Maya Johnson didn't just lose her job. She lost her professional identity. She lost her income. She lost her sense of security. For 3 years, she has fought, not just for herself, but for the truth, for accountability, for justice. Sandra turned to look directly at the defense table. The defendants knew their system was flawed. They knew patients were dying, and they chose to cover it up rather than fix it. They chose to destroy Maya Johnson rather than listen to her. This wasn't negligence. This was a deliberate, coordinated campaign to protect profits at the expense of human lives. Her voice softened as she addressed the jury one final time. "You have the power to send a message today. A message that patient safety matters more than profit, that truth matters more than corporate reputation, that one person with the courage to stand up for what's right deserves our protection, not our punishment." As Sandra returned to her seat, the courtroom remained utterly silent. Maya squeezed her hand in gratitude, unable to speak past the emotion tightening her throat. Richard Grayson approached the podium with none of his previous confidence. His closing argument focused on damage control, acknowledging miscommunications and procedural oversights, while still attempting to frame Maya as a difficult employee who had misunderstood complex technical issues. Were mistakes made? Yes, he conceded. But the characterization of these events as a deliberate conspiracy is simply not supported by the evidence. What we have here is a cascade of individual errors, misinterpretations, and system limitations that, when viewed with the benefit of hindsight, created the appearance of something more sinister. His argument seemed hollow even to his own ears, his usual rhetorical flourishes abandoned in favor of technical equivocations and appeals to reasonable doubt. The jury's expressions ranged from skeptical to openly hostile as he attempted to minimize the significance of the evidence they had seen. When Grayson finished his closing, Judge Harrison provided instructions to the jury, explaining the legal standards they should apply and the questions they needed to answer. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, Maya felt strangely calm. Whatever happened now, the truth was out. The system that had protected Westfield Medical Center's secrets for years had finally begun to unravel. In the hallway, Sandra was approached by Gerald Hoffman, the crisis management attorney who had joined the defense team. "We need to talk," he said quietly, "before the jury comes back." Sandra glanced at Maya, who nodded her approval. They followed Hoffman to a private conference room where Catherine Westfield waited, looking haggard and defeated. "The hospital board met in emergency session last night," Hoffman began without preamble. "They've authorized me to offer a new settlement proposal, one that acknowledges the full extent of what's happened." Maya studied Catherine Westfield's face. The imperious board chairwoman who had watched the trial with such cold calculation was gone, replaced by a woman who seemed to have aged a decade overnight. "We're listening," Sandra said cautiously. $20 million in compensatory damages to Ms. Johnson," Hoffman stated. "A public acknowledgement of system defects and the implementation of comprehensive safety reforms. Full cooperation with any investigations by regulatory agencies or law enforcement, and most importantly, a patient compensation fund of $100 million for families affected by medication errors." Maya's eyes widened at the figures, but she remained silent, waiting for the catch. "In exchange," Hoffman continued, "we ask only that Ms. Johnson not pursue personal criminal charges against individual hospital employees or board members." "That's not my decision to make," Maya replied evenly. "Criminal prosecution is up to the district attorney." "We understand that," Hoffman acknowledged. "We're simply asking you not to advocate for it. The evidence you've presented will speak for itself." Maya considered the offer carefully. It addressed the core issues: accountability, patient compensation, system reform, without the uncertainty of a jury verdict or the years of appeals that would likely follow. "I need to speak with the families," she said finally. "They deserve a voice in this decision." Catherine Westfield spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "My son is cooperating with authorities. The system flaws were more extensive than anyone realized, affecting not just Westfield, but every hospital using Meditech's software. A nationwide recall is being initiated today." The admission hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement of the far-reaching consequences of their cover-up. Maya felt the weight of the decision before her, knowing that whatever she chose would affect not just her own future, but the lives of countless patients nationwide. "Give me an hour," she said, rising from her seat. "I need to speak with the families." The small chapel in the courthouse basement wasn't designed for gatherings like this, but it offered the only private space large enough for Maya to meet with all 7 families. They sat in a semicircle, their purple ribbons bright against the muted colors of the room, their faces reflecting varying degrees of grief, anger, and exhaustion. Maya stood before them, acutely aware of the weight of the moment. These people had lost parents, spouses, siblings, losses that no settlement could ever truly address. "The hospital has made an offer," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. $20 million in damages to me personally, $100 million to establish a compensation fund for all of you, public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, implementation of safety reforms, and a nationwide recall of the medication system. She watched their reactions: surprise, skepticism, confusion. "That's more than we ever expected," Diane Garcia said, breaking the silence. "What's the catch?" "They want me to agree not to push for criminal charges against individual hospital employees or board members," Maya explained. "I'd still cooperate with any investigation, but I wouldn't advocate for prosecution." Robert Jenkins, who had lost his wife to a heparin overdose, leaned forward. "So they're finally admitting fault, but they want immunity." Not legal immunity, Maya clarified. That's not mine to give. The district attorney will make those decisions independently. They're just asking me not to actively campaign for criminal charges. Why are you bringing this to us? Asked Eleanor Diaz, whose father had died 3 years ago. This is your case, your settlement. Maya took a deep breath. Because this stopped being just about me the moment I learned your family members had died. Their names were in my reports, the ones the hospital ignored. In a way, I've been fighting for them as much as for myself. She moved to sit among them, no longer separate but part of their circle. I need to know what justice looks like to you. Would it be criminal charges against Dr. Phillips or Catherine Westfield? Financial compensation? System-wide reforms to prevent this from happening to other families? The room fell silent as the families exchanged glances, processing her question. Finally, James Monroe, a retired pastor whose wife had died, spoke up. When Margaret died, they told me it was her time, that her kidneys were failing anyway, that sometimes medicine can only do so much. His voice trembled. I believed them because they were the experts. I lived with guilt thinking I should have brought her in sooner, that I missed some sign. He looked directly at Maya. What I want most is the truth, officially acknowledged. I want her death certificate to reflect what really happened. I want the hospital to look me in the eye and admit they lied. Others nodded in agreement. Diane Garcia added, I want reforms that will actually save lives. Criminal charges might satisfy our anger, but will they really change the system? What happens if we go to verdict instead? Robert Jenkins asked. We might win more in damages, Sandra explained, but the hospital would almost certainly appeal, tying the case up for years. There would be no immediate accountability, no compensation fund, potentially no system recall until all appeals were exhausted. And the truth might get buried again in legal maneuvering, Maya added. Eleanor Diaz, who had been quiet, finally spoke. My father was a surgeon for 40 years. He believed in the system, even as it was killing him. He used to say that medicine isn't about punishing mistakes, it's about preventing them from happening again. She looked around the circle. I think he would want the reforms, the acknowledgement, the compensation for families. He would want change more than vengeance. Maya listened as each family shared their perspective. Some wanted accountability above all. Others prioritized preventing future tragedies. All wanted official acknowledgement of what had really happened to their loved ones. After nearly an hour of discussion, a consensus began to emerge. Eleanor articulated it first. We want 3 additions to the settlement. First, a formal apology to each family delivered in person by hospital leadership. Second, amended death certificates that accurately reflect the medication errors as contributing factors. And third, a patient safety oversight committee with family representation to ensure the promised reforms are actually implemented. Maya nodded, taking notes. Is everyone comfortable with these terms? One by one, they signaled their agreement. The anger in the room hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something more focused, more purposeful. As the families filed out to return to the courtroom, James Monroe lingered behind. Whatever happens with the settlement, he told Maya, you've already given us something invaluable. For 3 years, we thought we were alone in our grief, in our questions. You brought us together. You gave us answers. Maya squeezed his hand, unable to find words adequate to the moment. In the conference room, Catherine Westfield and Gerald Hoffman waited tensely for Maya's decision. Sandra presented the family's additional requirements without preamble. Personal apologies? Catherine repeated, looking stricken. To each family? In person, Sandra confirmed. Not a form letter, not a press release. Face-to-face acknowledgement of what happened to their loved ones. Catherine seemed about to object, but Hoffman placed a restraining hand on her arm. "We can agree to that," he said. "The amended death certificates may require coordination with the medical examiner's office, but will facilitate the process. And the oversight committee is non-negotiable," Maya added, "with real authority, not just a public relations gesture." Catherine's gaze dropped to the table. "My son is facing potential criminal charges from the FDA," she said quietly. "His company is finished. Everything we built." She trailed off, then looked up at Maya with eyes that held not anger, but a profound weariness. "Yes, we agree to all terms." The settlement agreement was drafted quickly, with both legal teams working together to incorporate the additional requirements. When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Harrison was informed that a settlement had been reached, and the jury was dismissed with his thanks. As the judge reviewed the settlement terms, Maya observed the reactions around the courtroom. The families sat together, united in their bittersweet victory. Helen Davis and Dr. Patel exchanged relieved glances, their professional sacrifices vindicated. Catherine Westfield sat alone at the defense table, Grayson having moved away as if to distance himself from the hospital's admissions of wrongdoing. Judge Harrison looked up from the document, his expression solemn. "This settlement addresses the civil claims before this court," he noted. "It does not preclude criminal investigation or prosecution. I will be referring the evidence presented during this trial to the district attorney, the state medical board, and the Food and Drug Administration for their independent review." He turned to Maya. "Ms. Johnson, do you understand and accept these settlement terms?" Maya rose, feeling the weight of 3 years of struggle, of sleepless nights and unanswered questions, of doubt and determination. "I do, Your Honor." "Then this court approves the settlement as outlined. Further, I want to commend Ms. Johnson for her persistence in seeking justice, not just for herself, but for the patients affected by these systemic failures." As the judge brought down his gavel, concluding the case, Maya felt a complex wave of emotions: relief, vindication, exhaustion, and a quiet but profound sense of closure. The legal battle was over, but she knew the work of reform was just beginning. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around the steps, cameras flashing as Sandra made a brief statement announcing the settlement. Maya stood silently beside her, watching as Catherine Westfield slipped out a side entrance, pursued by a separate swarm of journalists. "Ms. Johnson, how does it feel to win against Westfield Medical Center?" a reporter called out. Maya considered the question carefully before responding. This wasn't a moment for triumph or gloating, but for something more nuanced. "This was never about winning or losing," she said finally. "It was about truth, about accountability, about making sure that when patients enter a hospital, their safety comes before profits or reputation or convenience." She glanced at the families standing nearby. "Today doesn't undo the harm that was done, but it does ensure that these losses weren't in vain. Change is coming to healthcare, and these families are helping to lead it." As the media briefing concluded, Maya found herself surrounded by the 7 families, each wanting to express their gratitude, to share memories of their loved ones, to acknowledge the strange bond that now connected them all. In that moment, standing in the afternoon sunlight, Maya realized that what had begun as her solitary fight for justice had become something far more powerful: a movement, a community, a voice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. 1 month after the settlement, Maya stood in the hospital auditorium, watching as Catherine Westfield delivered the first of 7 promised apologies. The families had chosen to receive them together rather than individually, a decision that spoke to the bond they had formed during the trial. The auditorium was packed with hospital staff, board members, and media representatives. Maya recognized many familiar faces among the hospital employees: nurses she had worked alongside for years, doctors who had once respected her judgment, administrators who had looked the other way during her systematic removal. Catherine approached the podium, visibly diminished from the imperious figure who had commanded the courtroom just weeks earlier. The investigation into Meditech Solutions had expanded, revealing that her son had knowingly concealed system defects not just at Westfield, but at hospitals nationwide. He was now facing federal charges, and the family's reputation lay in ruins. To the families of Maria Garcia, Margaret Monroe, Edward Diaz, Sophia Jenkins, Thomas Wilson, Clara Martinez, and Joseph Taylor, Catherine began, her voice unsteady. I offer my deepest and most sincere apologies for the failures that contributed to the loss of your loved ones. Maya watched the family's faces as Catherine continued, acknowledging each patient by name, detailing the specific medication errors that had gone unreported, and admitting the hospital's deliberate cover-up of these fatal mistakes. Some family members wept quietly. Others sat stone-faced, their grief having long since hardened into something beyond tears. We cannot undo the harm we have caused, Catherine concluded. But we can and will honor your loved ones by ensuring such failures never happen again. The reforms we are implementing today will bear their names and serve as a lasting reminder of our obligation to put patient safety above all other considerations. After the formal apology came the announcement of the James Monroe Patient Safety Oversight Committee, named for Margaret's husband, who had been so instrumental in shaping the settlement terms. Maya had been asked to serve as its first chairperson, a role she had accepted after considerable reflection. As she took the podium to outline the committee's authority and objectives, Maya felt the weight of transitioning from whistleblower to reformer. For 3 years, she had been fighting against a system determined to silence her. Now she was being invited to help rebuild that system from within. The committee will have unprecedented access to hospital data, quality metrics, and incident reports, she explained. We will review all adverse events, near misses, and system vulnerabilities with the authority to implement immediate corrective actions where necessary. She looked out at the hospital staff, many of whom had once been her colleagues. But this committee isn't just about oversight. It's about creating a culture where every healthcare worker feels empowered to speak up when they see potential harm, without fear of retaliation. In the weeks that followed, Maya threw herself into the work of reform. The compensation fund was established, with an independent board reviewing claims from affected families. The medication system was replaced entirely, with new safeguards designed specifically to prevent the types of errors that had occurred. Most significantly, the death certificates were amended, each now bearing the truth that had been denied for so long. Maya had accompanied James Monroe to the medical examiner's office when he received his wife's corrected certificate. He had wept as he traced his finger over the words, "Medication-induced coagulopathy, secondary to excessive anticoagulation," his shoulders shaking with the release of 3 years of doubt and unwarranted guilt. "Now I can grieve properly," he had whispered. "Now I can finally let her rest." 6 weeks after the settlement, Maya received an unexpected visitor at her small office in the hospital's administration wing. Dr. Phillips, the medical director who had played a central role in her termination, stood awkwardly in her doorway. "May I come in?" he asked, his usual confidence notably absent. Maya gestured to the chair across from her desk, studying him with detached curiosity. He had been removed as medical director but allowed to remain on staff in a reduced clinical role, a compromise the families had reluctantly accepted in exchange for his cooperation with ongoing investigations. "I've been asked to resign from the hospital," he said without preamble. "The board feels my continued presence is problematic." Maya said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "Before I go, I wanted to say—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I wanted to say that you were right, about the system, about the patients, about all of it." "I know," Maya replied simply. You have to understand, we truly believed the issues were isolated incidents. By the time we realized the pattern, patients had died, and we were legally exposed. It seemed safer to manage the problem quietly than risk the hospital's reputation. Safer for whom? Maya asked, her voice level but pointed. Dr. Phillips had no answer for that. After a moment, he continued, "The DA has offered me a deal, full cooperation in exchange for immunity from the most serious charges. I'll lose my medical license, but I'll avoid prison. Are you asking for my blessing?" Maya's tone remained neutral, professional. "No." He shook his head. "I don't deserve that. I'm telling you because you should know that I'm going to tell them everything. Every meeting, every decision, every person involved in the cover-up." Maya studied his face, searching for signs of the arrogance that had once defined him. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "Good. The families deserve the complete truth." After he left, Maya sat alone in her office, reflecting on the strange turns her life had taken. 3 years ago, she had been a respected nurse doing the job she loved. Then came the discovery, the reports, the retaliation, the long fight for justice. Now she found herself in a position of authority, helping to reshape the very institution that had once destroyed her career. That evening, she met with the families at Diane Garcia's home for their now regular support group meeting. What had begun as a strategic alliance during the trial had evolved into a genuine community, part grief circle, part advocacy group, part extended family. "The foundation paperwork is finally complete," Diane announced as they gathered in her living room. "The Seven Voices Patient Safety Foundation is officially a non-profit organization." The foundation had been the family's idea, a way to channel their settlement funds towards systemic healthcare reform beyond just Westfield Medical Center. Maya had helped connect them with advocacy groups nationwide, building a network of allies committed to improving patient safety through policy change, education, and support for whistleblowers. "We've already received inquiries from 3 other hospitals interested in implementing our oversight model," Eleanor Diaz added. As a retired healthcare administrator herself, she had taken a leading role in developing the Foundation's hospital engagement strategy. "And the first scholarship applications are coming in," Robert Jenkins reported. The Foundation had established nursing scholarships specifically for students committed to patient advocacy and ethical practice, named in honor of the 7 patients whose deaths had exposed the system's failures. As the meeting continued, Maya listened more than she spoke, marveling at how these families had transformed their grief into purpose. They discussed upcoming legislative hearings, media appearances, and educational initiatives, all aimed at ensuring that what happened at Westfield would spark meaningful change nationwide. Later, as Maya drove home, she reflected on the complex legacy of her 3-year battle. The personal cost had been enormous, her career derailed, her finances drained, her confidence shaken. Yet the outcome had far exceeded anything she could have imagined when she first noticed those medication discrepancies. It wasn't just about the settlement money, substantial as it was. It wasn't even about the vindication of having her concerns finally validated. It was about these 7 families finding purpose in their pain. It was about healthcare workers at Westfield and beyond now having clearer pathways to report concerns. It was about patients whose lives would be saved by systems designed to prevent the very errors that had gone unaddressed for so long. As she pulled into the driveway of her small house, the same one she had nearly lost to foreclosure during the years of unemployment following her termination, Maya felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for years. The fight wasn't over. Perhaps it never would be. But the truth had emerged, justice had been served, and healing, for herself, for the families, and for the broken system itself, had finally begun. 1 year after the settlement, Maya stood at a podium in the state capitol rotunda, preparing to address the gathered legislators, healthcare advocates, and media representatives. Behind her sat the families, 7 empty chairs among them, each bearing a purple ribbon and a photograph. Beside her stood Governor Elaine Martinez, who had championed the landmark legislation now known as the Westfield 7 Patient Safety Act. "A year ago today," Maya began, her voice steady and clear, "a court case revealed how 7 patients died because profits were prioritized over safety and because those who spoke up were silenced. Today, we transform that tragedy into protection for patients across our state." The journey to this moment had been arduous but purposeful. In the months following the settlement, Maya and the families had channeled their experiences into concrete policy proposals, working with healthcare experts, legislators, and advocacy groups to draft legislation that would prevent similar tragedies. "This law establishes the strongest whistleblower protections in the nation for healthcare workers," Maya continued. "It creates an independent patient safety oversight board with real enforcement authority. It mandates transparent reporting of medication errors and adverse events. And perhaps most importantly, it eliminates the confidential settlements that have long allowed dangerous practices to remain hidden from public view." As she spoke, Maya spotted familiar faces in the crowd. Sandra Wilson sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Helen Davis and Dr. Patel stood together near the back, both having found new positions at hospitals committed to ethical practices. Even Judge Harrison was present, his attendance a silent acknowledgement of the case that had sparked this sweeping reform. After the ceremonial bill signing, Maya found herself surrounded by nursing students, many wearing purple ribbons of their own. They had been following her story since the trial, drawing inspiration from her persistence in the face of institutional pressure. "How did you find the courage?" one young woman asked, her eyes earnest behind wire-rimmed glasses. "How did you keep fighting when everyone was against you?" Maya considered the question carefully. "I didn't feel particularly courageous at the time," she admitted. "I just knew what I had seen, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. Sometimes courage is simply refusing to look away when it would be easier to do so." Later that evening, Maya joined the families for a private dinner, a tradition they had established to mark significant milestones. Their relationships had deepened over the past year, transcending their shared tragedy to become genuine friendship. Diane Garcia raised her glass in a toast. "To the Westfield 7, whose lives continue to save others." "And to Maya," James Monroe added, "who refused to let them be forgotten." Maya felt a familiar tightness in her throat as they clinked glasses. "To all of you," she responded, "who transformed grief into action." The conversation flowed easily as they updated each other on recent developments. The Seven Voices Foundation had expanded its reach nationally, now offering support to whistleblowers in healthcare facilities across the country. Eleanor Diaz had just returned from testifying before a congressional committee on medication safety. Robert Jenkins was developing a patient advocacy training program for nursing schools. "Have you heard the latest about Westfield?" Diane asked as dessert was served. Maya nodded. The hospital had undergone a complete leadership overhaul in the wake of the scandal. Catherine Westfield had resigned from the board shortly after delivering her apologies, her reputation irreparably damaged by both the cover-up and her son's criminal case. The new administration had embraced transparency with almost religious fervor, transforming Westfield into a case study in institutional redemption. "They've asked me to come back," Maya said quietly, "as Chief Patient Safety Officer." The table fell silent, all eyes turning to her. "Are you considering it?" Eleanor asked finally. "I am," Maya admitted. "Not for my own sake, but because systems only change when people committed to change work from within them." "Whatever you decide," James said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "We support you." After dinner, Maya walked alone through the city park, needing time to process the day's emotions. The path took her past the hospital where she had worked for 15 years, its illuminated windows glowing against the twilight sky. She paused, studying the familiar building with new eyes. Her journey had come full circle in ways she never could have anticipated. From dedicated nurse to terminated whistleblower, from plaintiff seeking justice to architect of systemic reform, each phase had shaped her, challenging her understanding of institutions, power, and her own capacity for resilience. The settlement money had provided financial security, allowing her to focus entirely on advocacy work. The public vindication had restored her professional reputation, opening doors that had once seemed permanently closed. But the most profound change had been internal, a quiet confidence that came from facing her worst fears and emerging stronger. As Maya continued her walk, her phone buzzed with a text from Sandra. "CBS Morning News wants to interview you about the new law. Interest?" Maya smiled, typing back, "As long as they include the families too. This was never just my story." 2 days later, Maya sat in the hospital boardroom, facing the new CEO and chief medical officer across a polished table. The job offer was both generous and thoughtful, a role designed to leverage her unique experience and perspective, with explicit authority to implement safety reforms without interference. "We understand your hesitation," the CEO said. "Westfield failed you and the patients in your care, but that's precisely why we need someone like you. Someone who won't be silenced, who holds the institution accountable to its highest purpose." Maya studied their faces, searching for signs of the institutional arrogance that had once characterized Westfield's leadership. Instead, she found something that looked remarkably like humility. "If I accept," she said carefully, "I would need complete independence, direct board reporting, transparent communication channels for staff concerns, and continued involvement with the Seven Voices Foundation." "We anticipated those requirements," the CMO replied, sliding a document across the table. "They're already written into the job description." Maya took the paper, a sense of symmetry washing over her. 3 years ago, she had walked out of this very building in shock, her career seemingly destroyed. Now she was being invited back, not despite her whistleblowing, but because of it. "I'll consider it," she promised, tucking the offer into her bag. That weekend, Maya visited the memorial garden the families had established, a peaceful space with 7 flowering trees, each representing a life cut short by systemic failure. She often came here when facing difficult decisions, finding clarity in the quiet reminder of why her work mattered. As she sat on a bench beneath Maria Garcia's cherry tree, Maya reflected on the strange alchemy that had transformed tragedy into purpose. The patients could not be brought back. Their families would always carry the pain of loss, and the healthcare system remained imperfect despite hard-won reforms. Yet something profound had changed. The culture of silence that had once protected negligence was giving way to a new ethic of transparency. The lonely battle she had fought for 3 years had evolved into a movement with national reach, and the families who had once been isolated in their grief now led a community dedicated to saving lives. Maya had learned that justice rarely arrives in a single dramatic moment. Rather, it emerges gradually through persistent effort, through countless small acts of courage, through unexpected alliances, through the painstaking work of rebuilding broken systems. As the afternoon light filtered through cherry blossoms, Maya made her decision. She would accept the position at Westfield, completing her journey from outsider to changemaker. She would bring everything she had learned, all the hard-won wisdom, all the righteous anger, all the compassionate understanding, back into the institution that had once rejected her. Not to forget the past, but to honor it. Not to erase the scars, but to ensure they served as reminders. Not to silence the voices of those who had been lost, but to amplify them in service of a better future. Maya touched the rough bark of the cherry tree, feeling strangely at peace. "We're still fighting," she whispered to the absent Maria. And we're winning, bit by bit. As she walked out of the garden, Maya's phone lit up with messages. Diane sharing news about an upcoming foundation event, Sandra forwarding media requests, a nurse from another state seeking whistleblower support. The work continued, expanding in ways she could never have imagined when she first noticed those medication discrepancies 3 years ago. The truth had emerged. Justice had been served. And healing, the most complex, challenging part of the journey, continued its gradual, imperfect progress, one day at a time.